One way to overcome this is to establish trust between medical professionals and these communities, and clinical trials are one way to open that door. Our good friend Peter Pitts, the former FDA Associate Commissioner, just did a presentation on the topic of health literacy and the impact of COVID-19. So we are bringing him in to give us a little bit more context. As always, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Can you share with us some of your presentation with our viewers?
Thanks, Tabitha. One of the crucial issues when it comes to COVID-19 isn't just beating the pandemic, and we're on our way to getting that done, but also learning the lessons that it's teaching us. Winston Churchill said, never let a crisis go to waste. And if we don't learn from COVID-19 and apply it to other issues, shame on us. What does diversity in clinical trials mean? Well, it certainly means that people need to recognize that there are people who look like them, not only participating in the clinical trials, but also being investigators and technicians behind those trials. Very important across the whole spectrum of ethnicity and gender and so forth. But what's also important is to recognize that impacts our ability to fight, for example, vaccine skepticism or the suspicion on the part of various communities of color that the government and drug companies and the healthcare system overall really isn't there for them. If they don't see themselves in the system, they can't trust that the system is going to be there for them. So that's crucially important, and the JAMA numbers certainly back that up. But equally important is recognizing that when you look at certain diseases, like, for example, cardiovascular diseases, where African Americans overrepresent in terms of having those problems, clinical trials need to be designed and recruit to recognize not just the percent of the population, but the percent of the population that suffers from that kind of disease. We've got a long way to go, but COVID-19, I think, really has given us a harsh wake-up call that this has got to rise close to the top of the agenda.
And Peter, why is the history important when it comes to distrust of vaccines within communities of color?
Well, there's a whole history of the healthcare system and healthcare professionals treating people of color with a total lack of respect and lying to them. Obviously, there's the Tuskegee experiment that we all know about, Henrietta Leaks and so forth. But we have to recognize that it goes beyond kind of these anecdotal, horrible circumstances to the point where people of color and people from lower demographic income areas simply are not being served adequately when it comes to their own health care. And that's got to change. People need to see change to trust that change will actually happen. For example, these days, we can look at somebody from the genetic level, and we recognize, let me put it this way, 10 years ago, scientists said, we don't need diversity in clinical trials because we're all the same underneath our skin. And now with our more sophisticated understanding of the human genome, we know that's not right, that people of color, of various ethnicities and religions have different types of genetic makeups, and that's important in terms of not just designing drugs, but understanding which drugs to give to which people in which circumstance. And certainly, these are new drugs. Oftentimes, they're very expensive, and people that the companies and the government that pays for these drugs want to know that they're being given to the right people at the right time in the right dose. And so it's a scientific question as well as a social one. It's very exciting if we can get it right.
And so how do you go about actually educating and recruiting individuals in these different communities?
Well, first of all, even if we weren't talking about diversity at all, recruiting patients for clinical trials is extremely hard. Part of the problem is a lot of these clinical trials are done in specific test sites that are not accessible to a lot of people that might want to participate. So now we've learned through the COVID-19 experience the value of telemedicine. The FDA is recognizing the need to rethink its way that clinical trials can be done that produce solid and reliable data. People don't necessarily need to go to hospitals to participate in clinical trials all the time as they do now. But most importantly, we need to reach out and educate people as to the urgency of participating. We need to reach out to various community organizations and let them know, listen, let some scientists, let people from the FDA, let people from drug companies, let people from hospitals come to your church, come to your community meetings and talk about the importance of participating in trials. It's not easy. You can't push a button and make it happen. There's a lot of shoe leather work that is required, and we need to start lacing up our shoes and getting it done as quickly as possible. It's not going to be easy, but it's profoundly important.
What is that process like? If I were to get recruited for a trial or I were to volunteer, what would that whole thing end up being?
Well, part of the problem with clinical trials is that it includes this thing called science, and it's complicated.
I've heard of it.
So we also, since we're all now celebrating, including myself, the fact that science is back. Science is in the front seat. Science is being respected. We have to also recognize that the last time most people touched science was in high school, where there was a right answer and a wrong answer, and you were dissecting frogs.
Sure.
When it comes to clinical trials for therapeutic products and vaccines, it's very complicated. There are lots of gray areas. So part one is figuring out in easy to understand, truthful, kind of linear terms what a clinical trial is, how it works, why it's important. And really what it comes down to is being part of a group of people. Some people get a drug, some people get a placebo, and there are various measurements in terms of what happens to these people. We're most familiar with that now relative to all the statistics we're seeing for the vaccines against COVID-19. Explaining it can't be difficult. Einstein said, if you can't explain something simply, you clearly don't understand it. Another great quote is that a key facilitator of velocity is participation. And I'll tell you who said that, me. We're not going to be able to get things done quickly
Sure.
unless we have broad participation. And we're not going to gather trust unless people can see people like them as part of the process, from the scientific end, on the pharmaceutical bench chemist side, all the way through to clinical trials to who is actually using these products in the real world. And then, of course, there's the truth that on the genetic level, we are not all the same. And the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we're going to recognize the need to broaden our approach to both clinical trial design and clinical trial recruitment. Is it going to be hard? It's definitely going to be hard. But that makes it all the more important.
And as we continue to kind of talk about diversity in these trials, what about when it comes to minors or pregnant women? I understand that's also very difficult during this time as well.
One of the most important things about clinical trials, and I think one of the things that kind of keeps people away from doing what they recognize as an important public service, is that there's a degree of danger. Nothing is risk-free. But when it comes to the populations that you mentioned, kids, people under 17, and pregnant women, we have to be so careful. But that doesn't mean that we should not do clinical trials. And pediatric clinical trials for people under 17 is a great example when it comes to vaccines. Is it ethical to deny a child a vaccine in a clinical trial? Is it ethical to put a child at risk? And again, risk is a relative proposition. It really is measured against benefits. So when you look at childhood diseases, serious and life-threatening childhood diseases, the risk reward profile is somewhat different. But it's hard, if you think it's hard to recruit people for clinical trials, adults, it's infinitely more difficult to recruit children and pregnant women because they're cautious, and they should be. So again, it comes down to putting forward a very straightforward, understandable explanation why, under the appropriate circumstances and supervision, this becomes incredibly important.
Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on NBCLX.
My pleasure.